Yeah, ready. Thank you.
All right. Welcome, everyone. We are here for week 2 of the themed speaker series, The Power to Define. This speaker series is hosted by the course, the EDAD 600 course, the Pro Seminar and the African American Experience. And yet again, we're working with week 2 of The Power to Define. Now, for those who are new or revisiting or need a reminder, this speaker series promotes insights relevant to the psychosocial historical context of the African American person. We will address along this journey, some major pillars, if you will, of the African American experience. We worked with histories and systems with Dr. Leon last week. We have our dear Dr. Sherman this week with racial identity and self-understanding. We'll move forward also through our trajectory or through our pathway, if you will, with some prejudice and racism down the line and mental health and health for the African American, socialization dynamics and achievement and schooling. I want to say that our structure for this evening will be that Dr. Sherman will present after she's introduced. That is, she'll present for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. We will end thereabouts 6:15, and then the actual class will move forward a few minutes later and join for follow-up discussion. So I'd like to work on an introduction, and I'm pausing for effect because we have a surprise introductee.
Good evening, class. I hope all are well. There we go. I'm trying to.
There we go.
There we go. We good?
We're perfect. Dr. Leon. We have Dr. Leon here, who was our guest 2 weeks ago, our first guest. He set the pace. He set the pace for the speaker series. Dr. Leon is our political scientist. He provided us a history and systems of the power to define. He is the host of the Series XM Urban View 126 Inside the Issue and author of Politics, Another Perspective. Dr. Leon, he told me, he says, Sean, you cannot do this speaker series without Dr. Sherman. So, Dr. Leon, please introduce our esteemed guest.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks to Dr. Coleman for developing this course and focusing on the power to define the speaker series. As I said to you all during my presentation, the power to define is incredibly important and critical for a people who are interested in and hopefully moving towards some semblance of self-determination. And following along that line of thinking or that train of thought, let me tell y'all, you are in for a real experience this evening. Tonight's speaker is phenomenal. Her commitment to the education and uplift of our people and of our community is unparalleled. She is a journalist of the highest order. Her work at the Washington Informer newspaper is key to making what that historic paper is today. She is a publisher of her own magazine, Acumen, and that is a labor of love and a phenomenal publication that I am truly humbled to be a part of and contribute to. And she's a scholar. Her dissertation, In Search of Purity, Eugenics and Racial Uplift Among New Negroes, 1915 to 1935, is now a book. She examines the reinterpretation of eugenic theories by Black scholars who helped integrate the science into a social movement for racial uplift. Her research is groundbreaking, relevant, very much needed if we are interested in and hopefully moving towards some semblance of self-determination. Because understanding who you are, where you're from, and from whence you've come is key if you introduce to you a friend, a colleague, and a scholar, Dr. SHANTELLA Sherman.
Wow. I don't even know if I can get started after that, Dr. Leon. Thank you so very much. I am humbled as always to be in your presence, and I thank you as always for always talking me up. You big me up, and I'm absolutely grateful for that, because as you know, sometimes the work of scholars is completely overlooked by the masses, and the work itself needs to lend itself to the people who need to know it most. And so I'm always grateful to have a platform where I can teach and talk to young minds and old minds alike, and kind of push the understanding of eugenics and self-identity forward. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you so very much for having me. I'm grateful to be here with you. And so, as it's already been explained, most of what I do, I filter through a microscope of eugenics, because I believe it is one of the founding fabrics of this nation, of the globe really, but of this nation specifically. But it is completely overlooked in our laws, in our education system, in our housing policies, in our banking institutions. And yet it is detrimental to how we see ourselves, how we're seen by others, and why it is that even now in 2020, we're still having conversations about Black people, being human, being capable, right? And so I'm going to jump right into this. I know the format that we're using is that if you have questions, you're sending them over. I do take questions throughout in case I'm going through these slides a little quickly, and you feel like you need to break in. I'm all right with that as well. All right. So one of the things that we need to deal with first and foremost when we start talking about identity is, who are you? How do others define you? And then which is true? And particularly for African Americans, you know, you're not really clear. We're never really clear exactly who we are. And so we tend to wear a lot of masks. And a lot of times we're not even aware that we're wearing the masks, because it becomes such an intrinsic part of who we are and what we do. So these are just a few headlines. Again, as a journalist, these are some of the things that I've come across just in the last couple of years. Pregnant women in Ghana take pill to lighten unborn baby's skin. This is from the Huffington Post, January 2019. Another headline, West Alabama mother blames bullying for daughter 9 committing suicide because she was called Black and ugly by classmates. That's 2018, December edition of the Washington Post. And then from CNN 2019, banning skin bleaching products won't work as long as fair skin is linked to beauty and success. So how did we get here? Because the idea of skin currency is not new. And it's not just white and Black. It's intraracial, it's social, it's economic. And so how do we get to this point? And so for me, eugenics is always the main and most vibrant culprit. For those of you who don't know, eugenics is a science of quote unquote better breeding. It was an agrarian theory, a science that basically held that in the same way that you can take plants and animals and crisscross the genes to breed out certain traits, to breed in certain traits, you could also do this with people. So in the process, you have this gentleman, Francis Galton, who is a cousin of Charles Darwin, who decides to apply these same principles to people. And in applying them to people, you end up with a class structure and a classification that allows people to believe that they can breed out certain qualities, quantities, characteristics that they no longer want in their society. And what you have are two different platforms, positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Those with good genes should only breed with others who have good genes. Good stock. A lot of times you'll hear this with the president we currently have sitting in the White House, where he talks about the thoroughbred and how certain people with certain genes automatically are bred for intelligence. They have a racehorse set of genes where if they are failed by some type of disease, they always get over it. They're thoroughbreds. Good stock should only mix with good stock. Negative eugenics, those who are weak or have inferior genes, should be segregated and kept from those who have great genes. Now, you think in terms of what's in the genes. This is not just height, weight, things like that, eye color, hair texture. But it was believed within eugenics that you could also transmit within your genes things like criminality, immorality, poverty. If there was a relative that was an alcoholic 3 generations back, it was believed that that was in the DNA, and that it was determined every person within a successive 10 generations would also have that strain. And this way you could predict who would be a successful citizen and who would not. You could determine who should and should not marry because they would only breed, quote unquote, defective and corrupted people. And so we started to have a lot of theories about where Black people fit into this paradigm. How do you fit Black people into a system where you're talking about things like poverty as a determinant in your genes? And so if you can determine how many children a Black person has, or if they are in fact even human and should be a part of a system, you then have the basis for segregation. You then have the basis, quite frankly, for slavery. You have the basis for a criminal justice system that says all Black people are criminal types and therefore should be hyper surveyed. And so what we start to see are different laws that are pulled together that go not only from science, but also into law, also into classrooms, and they're part of biology courses. They're a part of economics courses. They're a part of what used to be race hygiene courses, home economics courses. Everyone is talking about how to secure your genes in the great chain of being. And African people, people with dark skin, are always considered to be at the bottom of this chain. So there comes a theory that basically says all Black people, all those of African descent, noted by dark skin, are a part of an African chain, and that they are at the top of the monkey or orangutan chain and at the bottom of the human chain. Now, we've had debates. I've had a lot of debates with a lot of people about, in present day, how this could still be considered a thing. We know that Black people are not monkeys, all right? But when you look at this, for instance, this is an applied eugenics textbook. Paul Popenoe did this book in 1920. It's my understanding that applied eugenics, with this portion of the book relating Africans in the trees with monkeys, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, was still in publication and still being used in American school systems in the 1970s. Okay, so just think about that in terms of when we talk about enslavement, we talk about Jim Crow, but when you're talking about school systems and how, oh, it's understood that Black people are human, Black people are people, but all of a sudden you see a Black child in a tree and connected to a chain of monkeys as a part, rather than connected to the human strain, it again sets up a system where educationally you're telling people the value of Black skin and of Black people. It also reinforces segregation in the sense that you have white young people who actually believe that they are somehow either in danger or their own education is in danger because they're now being placed in a space with people or a subspecies of people who will in some way damage their genes and their ability to stay pure or as pure as possible. I want to be really, really clear with you that even though eugenics as a science began roughly 1830, 1840 as a science, when we look at things as early as, say, the Dred Scott case, you're talking 1854, or 1857, and you'll see in the language of the law from the Supreme Court that Black people, Africans, are labeled a subspecies. All right, that goes right back to the eugenics label. And so you start to pull out Supreme Court rulings, Plessy versus Ferguson. Go back and actually look as students, as professors, go back and look at the actual documentation, read the letter of the law, and you'll start to see the language within it that tells you clearly these are eugenic statements. We're still talking about the chain of being. We're talking about evolution. And in the concept of eugenics, the evolution of Black people was halted or retarded at a certain point where they could not evolve beyond that of being animalistic, all right? And so it becomes very important in America to chart not just who is Black, who is white, but who is fit within each group. And so we come up with eugenics measurements. And the measurements entail measuring 122 different portions of the human body. This is the space between the nostrils. These are ear holes, the ear lobes, your fingertips, all different parts of your body. 122 different categories are measured to make sure that eugenics is not just something that's in science classes or in laboratories or in the halls of Congress. The idea was to make sure that the average person in America also understood their place in creating the perfect American phenotype. You wanted to protect your genes, but how did you do that if you didn't know exactly what was considered normal, what was considered average, and what was considered to be superior? They didn't want to deal with the defective, but what started to happen was you would have every year when a state fair would come into a state, they would literally have a booth, a tent, or a house that was built by the Eugenics Records Office, which still exists in Cold Springs Harbor, New York. And they would literally have nice folks from Cold Springs Harbor to come down and measure your children and measure families. And from that, you start to have a number of different vehicles to help out. So you have baby contests. The whole idea of a baby contest was initially a Better Babies Eugenics contest to determine if your baby was developing in such a way that they would make a great American. All right. They also had Fitter Families contests. So when we get to the 1920s and into the 1930s, and you start to have economically these depressions and recessions, the average person was thinking, we don't want to have babies right now. But if you had babies and the state noted that this was a white family that had 2, 3, 4, 5 children, they would measure these children, determine that they were great American types, and they would reward that family with either food rations or money. They all received certificates and things like that. Now, the measurements in and of themselves were not just measurements. They all had a meaning to them. And so in today's society, we use terms like idiot and imbecile and moron sometimes to denote people that we're just saying, oh, they're crazy, they're a little off. We play around with the terms, but understand that in eugenic terms, this meant something quite serious. Eugenics had infiltrated almost every portion of society, from the way in which you received marriage licenses or were denied marriage licenses, to school systems that determined what type of work a child would be able to do, what their capacity was based upon the measurements that they took. And then they also have what they call Binet and Goddard tests, which would be our standardized tests for today. They're like IQ tests based upon capacity. If a child scored between, I think it was under 30 at this point, they would be considered an idiot, which meant they had the mentality of a 3-year-old or younger. A low-grade imbecile had the 4 to 5-year-old mentality. Imbecile, 6 to 8-year-old, high-grade imbecile, 8 to 10, and moron, you can see 10 to 12. But if you look on the other side of that chart, it also tells you what the capacity of that person was as far as what type of work they would be able to do. So a child given these exams and these measurements at the age of 9, usually, somewhere between 8 and 9. We still do this today when we do standardized tests. We always test for the 3rd grade. The 3rd grade is a marker which says at the age of roughly 8 or 9 years old, it is believed that all Black people stop being able to learn. What you know or don't know by the time you are 9 years old as a Black person is supposed to be the totality of your capacity. All right. And so again, this is the reason why a lot of Black students would end up having a guidance counselor tell them, you know, the only thing you're going to be able to do is mop floors or be a maid or a domestic. And so it doesn't make sense to invest, number one, in your education, to go further into college yourself, or for the county or the state to invest money in your school system or in segregated schools, because Black people simply don't have the capacity to move forward. So you must understand, even now, when we start looking at these exams and these tests, standardized tests, a test isn't standardized because the people aren't standardized, unless, of course, you're looking for a rationale to push some people to the left or to the right. All right. And so within this space, again, I love this chart. This is a chart that you see on the left side of beauty pageant. And the idea was to ensure that every person in America understood what beauty was. All right. And so you also see beneath the women, first of all, cows, because again, this is an agrarian thought. And so if this is a state fair, in the same time you're picking the biggest squash and the best turkey, you're also picking the best bovine. So there are descriptors for what cows should look like, and then there are descriptors for what women should look like. And so there's a gradation that tells you from 1 to 7 what the women's bodies should look like if they're paraded before you. And then as the judges, which one should be the winner. So this wasn't at the discretion of the people who were actually the judges, but this was at the discretion of the Eugenics Records Office, which gave you a table. It gave you a template for determining what beauty was, so that there was a national standard. There once again was a phenotype for what was considered beautiful. And so, you know, usually if the whole scale is there, I would tell people none of the women that you see there on the little graphic would be the winner. There's another lady further off, number 7, who's just like a stick. She's straight up and down. And the idea is that a woman should not have many curves to her, because that would incite men. The job of a woman was to reproduce the nation. She's supposed to be a nation builder. So she is not there to excite men. She is there to have babies, to make the nation flourish, and to have this particular phenotype go on in perpetuity. And so what you have on the right, though, is the first Miss America in 1925. And she pretty much fits what would be considered a non-excitable type of female body. I'll leave that right there. But what I always ask is, when we think in terms of the Miss America pageants, Miss USA pageants, even Miss Black America pageants that we have today, how close are they to the very straight, very narrow, no curve type body phenotype that was originally defined as the Miss American phenotype in the 1920s? And without much hesitation and very few deviations, this is exactly what you would get even today. So to define fit, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the nude photos that came about at Yale, Harvard, and all of your Ivy League schools, probably starting in the turn of the century through the 1950s, that were exposed roughly in the 1990s. Basically, as a freshman student, every student that went to an Ivy League school was asked to walk through a room and have nude photos taken of them to basically get a measure of their posture. It was believed that you could tell and identify the mental capacity of a person based upon their gait, based upon the way that they walked, based upon their shoulders, the width, the lengths. And so what you start to have are finishing schools where young ladies are told, you need to walk around with a book on your head. I know many of you have had wives, daughters, maybe some of you men have also had to go through this process as well. Well, we talked about this as deportment. And basically, if I look at your posture, I should be able to tell whether or not you belong in a certain space. If I look at your posture, I should be able to tell whether or not you have the capacity to be in this room or in this space or within my group. I know whether or not you belong in this job. I know whether or not you should be my boss or whether you should be the domestic or the servant. And these are the type of rubrics that we created in this country using eugenics as the platform for it, that basically branched off into 100 different directions. Now, when you see the Miss America pageant and with a lot of the state fairs, especially if you're in New Jersey, what you would also have, they would call the Isle of Civilization. And so you would have Miss America at one end of the boardwalk, and at the very opposite end of the boardwalk, its polar opposite would be these Black women that they had paid to go out and say, now, these are the lesser people of the world. They would get the women to dress up, and it would be something that would mimic a human zoo. And the idea was to give, in the imagination of Americans coming to the state fair, the idea that there are humans, there are subhumans, and then there are savages. And this language permeates the newspapers of the day, in addition to permeating many of the commentaries, the books, the fantastical amusements that were taking place and starting to thrive at this point, whether it was live musical performances or stage performances or films. You start to get the imagination of what people are, different groups of people are, played out and displayed in film. And so a lot of what I do also looks at popular culture and how all of these scientific falsehoods made their way into pop culture. And even if you don't hear them talked about in scientific terms very much today, you will see them played out on screens, in television and in film constantly. And a lot of times you see it, you don't necessarily recognize it, even if it makes you feel slightly uncomfortable. This young kid, the little girl here, is also being measured at this point. This is a group of Black doctors in Harlem. This is, again, part of the belief that if we start measuring young Black kids early, we start to understand what their aptitude is. And it's always understood that they're coming from a marginalized household, meaning they're Black people who may not be married, who may not fit the American phenotype. Then you always need outside experts to kind of step in and give assistance to the parents, which means sometimes you're basically just overriding whatever family structures that the young people have. Also understanding, I've always make sure that I add this, even though it's a bit uncomfortable for people. You need to understand that Black people, especially Black children, have always been considered the amusements of this nation. And so up until the 1970s, you had a number of carnival games that were specific to young Black children. One of them was the African dip, which you see here. We think of it now, we call it the dunking booth. It was originally called the African dip or the coon dip. And basically you find some young Black kid, you make them sit in the booth, but the language of it, drop the nigger, hit the trigger, drop the nigger was the slogan that was pasted upon most of these things. The idea was to create thing-ism, all right? These are not children. These are not kids. This isn't something that should be happening to children, but because they're Black, you kind of give a wave to it. You also have, this is the African Dodger game. The photo that you're seeing here is actually from a 1944 Boy Scout pamphlet, asking the parents to send their kids to the Boy Scouts. They'll have lots of fun. There'll be lots of camp games. And this was on the brochure. You can still see this. There are a number of Jim Crow societies. The Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia has this on display there. But basically what you would have would be little Black children who would stick their heads through these holes, and a group of white kids, for their amusement, would throw the balls, and the child had to dodge the ball. You can see even today Popeye commercials and things like that, old cartoons, where they're showing these kids being hit with balls, concussions, teeth knocked out, all of this, but it was considered a game. Why? Because this was a part of an issue of thing-ism. Public opinion did not weigh on the side of these are children and this should not happen. It was basically, these are Black people, and so this is okay. Thing-ism, and again, otherness. When we're talking about the racial identity of Black people and identity formation, you can never get beyond the fact that in this country, in this nation, you've been limited by the fact that folks actually believe you're not quite human, you're subhuman, or you're second-class citizens. And then based upon that, the letter of the law, the imagery never actually fits the reality of who you are. So again, when we start talking about masks and trying to fit in and identity formation, it's almost as if it's been an uphill battle. I'm grateful with most things that African Americans have fared as well as they have, because I understand that this type of thing-ism, as Black colleges and universities are thriving, as Thurgood Marshall is being, pulled into the Supreme Court, all of these great things are happening at the same time. This thing-ism that you're seeing before you is still very much a part of the advertising, a part of the pop culture that young white children are enveloping at this point. They're taking it on, lock, stock, and barrel, because they don't necessarily know any better. And at the same time, the Black children that are around them are victims to it. When we look at this 1939, these are young white kids in Indiana who are preparing for a May Day pageant. They're dressing up in blackface to do their Negro song. The parents are there, the teachers are there, everyone is celebrating this. I use this photo as a marker so that today when we have discussions about white kids dressing up in blackface for Halloween, some of our members of Congress and our legislators who decided to dress up in blackface in law school and take pictures and have them placed in the yearbook. How as children, this was not necessarily seen as something that was wrong. And so when this child grows up and 2 generations later, as a 60 or 70-year-old man says, I don't understand why that was a problem. I didn't feel it was a problem for me to take a photo and have this placed in a yearbook, and people would see it and I knew that they would, and it was never a problem, was because this was a part of the thing-ism that we talk about, where again, it wasn't considered to be something that was negative. It was Black people as puppies, Black people as things, Black people as anything other than human. And so when we get to the psychological impact of otherness, it needs to be understood that it weighs heavily on the mind. When we start talking about self-esteem, it needs to be clear that self-esteem is not what you think of yourself. For African Americans, for most Americans at this point, self-esteem is what you've been told about yourself and what you've internalized, right? It has nothing to do with what you actually believe of yourself. It's what you've been taught. It's what you've been told. The other thing, there are no 2 people in all the world who are exactly alike, not even twins. And yet from the moment you get up until the time you go to bed, you are bombarded every day, all day, with messages, advertising, telling you what? You need to fix this. This isn't quite right. Get this done. Do this to your body. Alter this. Change this. Mimic that, until it's almost impossible to know who the real person is behind anything. All right. We're all feeling to some extent put upon by these types of messages, and they're coming out top speed, and they're coming out in new media, whether it's social media, whether it's the tweets, whether it's the advertising, it's the celebrity. Everyone now has a cell phone and they have an ability to show themselves through filters. So you never get a chance to actually see who they are. So when we again talk about society and self-esteem, I think that the psychologists Mamie and Kenneth Clark did an amazing job in conducting research to talk about the fact that what is projected outward is often a lot of internalized hurt. It's a lot of internalized confusion. And so when we look at who you consider to be dirty, stupid, unfit, criminal, damaged, these are messages that are being given to children from the time they can clearly understand. And then you have things like the news that reinforce these messages. And then you have social media that reinforces it. But a lot of this starts in households. What are children being told about themselves and the inferiority of the people around them that look like them, even if they don't necessarily believe it? And so we talk a little bit about dolls. There's an entire set of research that deals with Black children not having white doll babies in their households because it makes it seem as if there's an equality. There's a system where the doll is there and the Black child grows up thinking that they can access what white people have based upon the fact that they've had whiteness in their space all along. The trip of that is when white families have Black memorabilia, the Aunt Jemima cookie jar, the Uncle Mo's salt shakers, the salt and pepper shakers, that's there for comfort. That is there because these are subservient items that show the place and the function of Blackness in their households and in their lives and in society as a whole. But when you have white dolls that are actually quote unquote a part of the family, is this little girl is holding on to the doll is taking the picture along with her little brother. It creates psychological problems. These are studies that have been taking place for a long time, just trying to figure out what do we do. And it caused this surge, again, when we get to the 1940s and 1950s, where people start saying we need to create Black doll babies and Black soldiers and Black items that children can play with so that they see themselves and understand not just who they are in the world, but that the rest of the world may think one thing of it, but their people think something else of it. There is value here. You are not an animal. You are a man. You are a young woman. And so there is something called the eugenics of the Negro. I want to be clear that while eugenics has racial components to it, and it is absolutely racist in most of its manifestations, that Black people actually adopted eugenics for themselves. And in doing so, you have great scholars. It's not to take anything from them, but it is to put it in the context of exactly what it was. When you have folks like William Hannibal Thomas, he taught, I think, probably the most conservative form of eugenics, where he absolutely believed that Black people had been stunted and retarded in their evolution. He was strictly scientific with his messages. And if you were to read him, you would think you were listening or reading a Klansman's memoirs. Very, very, unless a Black person is mixed race and has some white genetic coding within him, he has no true value, right? Then you have Kelly Miller, who's up at Howard University, amazing scholar. But what he wanted to talk about was the fact that Black people would lose their identity because they were coming out of spaces where women were having 10, 15, or 20 children, under enslavement and out of enslavement, fresh out of enslavement. But these same families, once they got to Howard University, they started to learn the birth rate was declining greatly. And so when you're talking hard eugenics, the reality of it is Black people who had education, most of them had decided to wait to have children, to wait until they were more financially stable, to make sure they had finished school, to buy property or houses and other things, the same things that we do today, right? You want to make sure you're established before you decide to get married and have children. And because they were waiting, his belief was that those in the lower rungs of the Black society would continue to have children more rapidly and disastrously. And so those who had the education, the money, and the wherewithal to be a part of either that talented 10th or that professional class of Black people, they would be outnumbered. And in being outnumbered, they would lose the footing that their education and their economics were affording them, because basically the Black folks on the lower rung would destroy things for them. This goes into W.E.B. Du Bois's whole idea of the talented 10th. We celebrate the talented 10th, we talk about it, but we never talk about the rest of the theory, which was the submerged 10th. So Du Bois wasn't talking about 10% leading 80%, he was talking about 10% leading, and not talking about 10% leading 90, but 10% leading 80. There's 10% of a population that's supposed to automatically die out through survival of the fittest. And if you go back and read the Philadelphia Negro, he sets up a template that looks a lot like that eugenic structure that we saw with imbecile and moron and all of those labels. He doesn't use those labels, he uses grades 1 through 4. And he talks about the fact that you have a certain group of Black folks in that grade 4 level that are ne'er-do-wells. They are con artists, they are immoral, they are all of the things that are listed in that list of imbecile and moron, all right? And these are the Black people he felt would reproduce at manic, crazy levels, and through disease and just criminality would destroy the race from the bottom going up. All right, so we do need to deal with that. And again, it does not in any way negate many of his other theories. But by the time we get to 1932 and you have Du Bois and a number of other scholars promote birth control in the Birth Control Review, which was a part of Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger, we call her a eugenicist, but we don't necessarily call these men eugenicists. He talks about the fact that we have got to keep these Southern Blacks who are breeding recklessly from having children. And so the language does not necessarily change, even if the race of the people does. Again, these tests that we're looking at, they're aptitude tests and eugenics tests that were specifically taken, designed, classified on the campuses of Tuskegee, Howard, and Atlanta universities. The Eugenics Records Office worked directly with them. These records are readily available. You can get them, you can see them online, but it basically shows you that Black people grabbed hold of this and they took it to heart. And so when we get to a point where Black people are using eugenic language and structures, what always unfortunately infiltrates that system is also a belief in colorism and skin pigmentocracy, skin currency, the belief that if you have one drop of white blood, whether it shows up in your hair texture or your skin tone, you are somehow better than those who have darker skin tones, because the darker the skin tone it's a sign of a degeneracy or defectiveness, right? And it's not just the skin color itself. And so that's what I'm saying. We have to get to a point where we understand from the turn of the century until roughly 1970, there had to have been 200,000 or 300,000 documents, journal articles written by scholars on hybridity. I don't like the term, but this is a person of mixed race. The Eugenics Records Office, Kellogg, Carnegie, they all funded this research to try and determine if you have one parent who's Black and one parent who's white, that child, what is the representation genetically of that child when it comes to IQ tests, to morality, to capacity? What do you do with someone when they don't fit neatly into these boxes? And so this is why it became increasingly important, once again, to do these measurements and try and determine if a person has noticeably white blood in them, are they better off? Do they have better access? Not necessarily, but they do have a certain amount of mobility, which has been afforded them in many instances by society. So it almost looks like a self-fulfilling prophecy that yes, the lighter the person is, or the different the gradation of hair, the better they are because they have access to certain things. And so it opens up an entire space where the commercial industry moves in and starts talking about bleaching skin and straightening hair and getting the germplasm. You know, we didn't say DNA back then, but the germplasm, the skin coloring, to strip that away. One of the things that you see a lot when we start talking mixed race and marriage laws is the idea that miscegenation or race mixing will cause a mongrelization. If you look at, again, the letter of the law, you look at some of the laws that are on the books, they list miscegenation as a form of bestiality. Why? As you can see, this Black man in this photo actually looks like a monkey. You know, basically what they're telling you is that one person is human and the other person is some form of animal, less than human. And so it's a form of bestiality. So when you start to look at the law, the way the laws are written, you'll understand when we start looking at these segregation, we don't want to integrate our schools. Look at the signs that the people use, and the signs say things like, you know, we don't want race mixing. We don't want to destroy our race. We don't want, you know, these Black boys with our white daughters. All of this starts talking about breeding. And so once again, you're not talking about someone sitting in a classroom with someone else. You're talking about race mixing. You're talking about breeding out whiteness and having mixed race kids and all of this. When you look at the loving family picture here on the left, the issue was not the husband and wife as a Black woman and a white man. It was the children, because how do you classify children, especially the daughter and one of the sons, when these look like white children? So the fear was that this young white girl would marry some unsuspecting white man who doesn't know that her mother is Black or has Black parentage. And there would be what they call a throwback baby. Some Black baby is born who's very dark. That's a part of the genetic coding, and also means that this child born of this white girl with a Black mother will somehow be more inclined to criminality, to tearing up society with you know, her immorality, with not being a good citizen, and to damaging the phenotype of what is considered to be a good and normal American. I'm doing this. If someone wants to put the response in for this, I'd be happy to go back to this once we start taking a Q&A in a few minutes. But based upon everything I've said, you note that the woman in this photo on the right is of mixed race, all right? I just want you to look at the photo, and if someone can identify who the couple is. This is a marriage photo that was taken roughly 1860. And I just bear this in mind. We'll get to the actual answer later on. And whoever gets this answer right will get a copy of my book sent to them. But I just want to see if anyone can, now don't go look it up, but let's see if you can identify the couple in this photo. All right, I see Dr. Coleman like, yeah, if you have the answer, that's fine. But you would not believe who it is unless you already know who it is, all right? And so again, I just want you to understand that the number of books that were coming out saying things like, all scientific investigation of the subject proves the Negro to be an ape. and that he simply stands at the head of the ape family as the lion stands at the head of the cat family. The Negro is the only anthropoid or man-like ape, and that the gibbon, orangutan, chimpanzee, and gorilla are merely Negro-like apes, all right? This is something that did not necessarily stop this language. These theories didn't necessarily stop just because time went on. The Pickaninny frieze is an item that's been sold in Baltimore up through the 1970s. And I was just like blown that this is still the sign I saw one day going through Baltimore, like, you've got to be crazy, but it's still there. All right. So the imagery doesn't necessarily lose itself in the middle of this. Again, race and colorism as race hygiene. The belief was that dark skin means dirt. It means disease. It's not by accident that as soon as you have any type of outbreak of any type of disease in this country, the first thing someone says is Black people get it more, they're going to die first. They're more inclined to have it, this, and this. The reality is this is all conjecture. It is not based on anything that's racial, or the variables aren't there to say that this is about Blackness. This is about, if it's what we're dealing with now, COVID, one of the things that we constantly say is, what are the other variables? If more Black people are getting it, does that mean it's because more Black people are riding public transportation? Does that mean more Black people are working in industry where up until, 5 or 6 months into this, you start saying you have to wear masks? So they're the ones who are interacting with the public. Does it mean that Black people are, living in apartment complexes rather than in houses? So they're having shared spaces where they're coming in contact potentially with the COVID disease or virus. Those are things that aren't looked at. The first thing that's said is this is about color, and this is about race, all right? Most of the detergents, the advertising years ago always used Blackness to tell you you can get the white out of you can get the whiteness into your clothes the same way you can strip Black people of their color. You can clean it out. Again, germplasm, we start talking about pride in the race. Pride in your race demands that you look light, bright, and attractive. What I want to be clear about, though, is that these preparations weren't always about women. I think women kind of get the fold for the skin bleaching and things like that. But the original folks that these agents were designed for were Black men. And so once again, I can't give it to you as a question because you have part of it there. But the very first hair relaxers, straightening combs, were designed for Black men. And they were designed by the same Black man who created the stoplight. Garrett Morgan made the first hair relaxer. And I'm not talking about one of those old preparations. I'm talking about a preparation with some lye in it to straighten out that hair. And again, what you see is declaring war on bad hair. There's certain language in all of his ads that deal with germplasm. So basically what you're saying is, I need to be able to show that there's even a drop of whiteness in me through my hair in order to gain access to jobs and other things that I might need, right? And so just bearing this in mind as we start to pull to a close, if you go to Google and you type in unprofessional women's hairstyles, what you get are Black women's images of Black women with natural hair. How did your natural hair become something that's unprofessional, dysgenic, unhealthy, something that needed to be pulled back from, all right? Mockery turned co-op. One of the things that's happening a lot today is that magazines have decided, instead of finding Black models, what they can do is find a white model and just brown her up. And so we're starting to get this a lot, especially in Europe, but I get the feeling it'll make its way into America soon enough. So we have things like, again, in 1919, when we start to have Black women entering into industry, you have advertising in the Detroit newspapers and in Chicago Defender, where they're saying only light-colored girls need apply, or no hard-looking women need apply. And if you didn't understand what hard-looking meant, they would usually have a little bracket and they say, if you're darker than this, if you're shorter than this, if you're wider than this, don't bother to apply. So again, when we start talking about how you feel about yourself, what you think of yourself, what things you think need to be changed, what you feel is out of place, out of order, is broken. A lot of it is based upon what you're seeing in messages all day, every day about society around you and what the society around you thinks of you and where they place you. So where do we go from here? I am a firm believer that, you know, a lot of this stuff, again, as the psychologists talk a lot about, if we're getting our beliefs about ourselves from 0 to 3, 0 to 5, then we have to start in our own households. Do not use words that denote color, hair texture, height, or labels for children. The number of folks that I've come across who said as children they were named things like, nicknamed things like Midnight or Smokey, Blackie, Yellow Gal, Red, all of these different terms that denote skin tone, hair texture. It doesn't seem as if your kids are internalizing these things, but in many instances they are. Do affirm and reaffirm beauty that's around you, especially those that are tied to things that are considered to be socially unfit. Acknowledge your own bias. All of us have certain levels of bias that we deal with, all right? Do you think a person is less capable based upon some of these rubrics? Do you think a person is incapable based upon the fact that maybe the girl came in and she has red or purple braids? If a student comes to you and says that they come from Southeast DC or portion or part of Baltimore that you feel is full of people who are doing certain things, do you automatically have a slight against that student? Do you automatically assume that somehow that student is less capable than the other students in the room? Do you feel as a student that because you're from a particular space that you can't do what other students can? All right. For those of you, I always say, who are in the body of Christ, understand, people will throw the Bible at you really quick. Understand this, the Bible is the most dysgenic text you will ever find. Everyone in there is jacked up. All right. And that's okay. That's the whole point. That in and of itself is the point. Remember, self-esteem, again, is not what you believe about yourself, but what others have told you and what you've internalized. So with that, I'm closing out, and I think I actually hit my mark, Dr. Coleman. If you have questions, please, I'm ready to hear them. And if someone has a response to that question about who was in that photo, I'd love to hear it.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sherman. I mean, this was incredible. Definitely well needed. I appreciate this segment in this session, providing additional context and adding to our pillar of the lens of the African-American experience. Dr. Julius Davis said this was a great presentation. I can't thank you enough. And it was phenomenal. It is phenomenal because we're still in it. I do have 2 responses. One from Jacqueline St. John's mentioned that it was Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Nope, that was a good guess. You're in a good area, but nope.
We have a graduate student, Ursel Goddard, who mentioned the VAs, but I don't know who the VAs are. That's what was sent to us through the YouTube. Stephanie McLeod says Alexander Hamilton.
Nope.
And Ms. McLeod is also a doctoral student.
Yeah, that was a good guess. Again, you're on the right track, but nope, no cigar yet. Anyone else?
Our esteemed graduate student, additional esteemed graduate student, because all of them are esteemed, John Quincy Adams.
Nope. So
Robert Johnson offered that.
All right, I'll give you one last hint to this. When you think in terms of the man least likely to have a Black woman as his wife, all right, not just you say that could be anyone, but
Donald Trump. Sorry, I'm sorry. It's not comedy hour.
Anybody?
And near what you said, the mid to late 1800s?
That was a wedding photo from 1861.
Wow. I'm so tempted to Google it.
Okay, I'm gonna give you all a hard pass, but
Abraham Lincoln.
no.
That was from Robert Johnson. He's going to quick because he wants that book.
You know what? I'll donate the book in, but that is, drum roll, Jefferson Davis, the father of the Confederacy.
Oh my goodness.
He is 38 years old in that photo. His wife, Verena, is 19.
Wow.
So, and wait, let me see if I can go back to this. Oh, there you go. All right. Jefferson Davis and his wife, Verena.
And he was 38 years old?
38 years old. She's 19.
Wow. That's all I have to say is wow. I have so many other thoughts that I can't say because we're being recorded, but wow.
Okay, well, so again, when we start talking about, enslavement and then racially, especially in the South, how you determine a person's racial identity. I just kept saying a few years later, when they started doing measurements, everyone kept saying in newspapers, he married a Negro. He married a Negro. He married a quadroon. They just kept talking about this in newspapers.
Yeah.
So, but it's like, yeah, that's Verena. That's Jefferson Davis who tore it down. All right.
So I have a question for you from soon to be Dr. Johnson, Robert Johnson. Colorism versus eugenics are they one and the same?
They can be combined. I don't separate them at all, because again, I think when we start talking about the value of skin, again, skin currency, if you tell me you simply have a preference, a visual preference to someone who's lighter or darker, that's not eugenic. That's not even colorism. Mm-hmm. But if you tell me that a person who is lighter is better, or a person who's darker is better, and we have eugenic strains that work either side. So you had a whole group with Marcus Garvey that talked about the purity and power of Black African dark genes and how they were being diluted by mixed race folks. So you have both strains of this, but when you start to add character and you classify folks as greater than or less than based upon skin tone, their aptitude based upon skin tone, their propensity for violence or crime, that's eugenic. And so you can't necessarily separate eugenics and colorism from one another.
Thank you. I have a message, an editorial from my esteemed colleague, Dr. Julius Davis. This presentation is so aligned with critical race theory perspective that race and racism is embedded in the fabric of American society.
Absolutely. You cannot take it out. And so again, even if you're looking at the Supreme Court, when they make different rulings, up through the little Italian guy that recently passed away. I can't call his name. He just passed a couple of years ago. Supreme Court Justice.
Scalia.
Thank you, Scalia. Anthony Scalia he made a comment about entry into universities and the affirmative action policy. And he noted that, Black people are incapable. They really shouldn't, a university shouldn't be forced to accept Black people, because it's understood that they have a greater propensity for failure, because they don't have the aptitude for it. And he used the bell curve. Well, the bell curve uses half of the documentation that I'm speaking about with eugenic theories, Paul Popenoe and others who talk about Black people simply are animals as opposed to people.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Coleman?
Yes.
So, Dr. Shantella, phenomenal presentation.
Thank you.
Wanted to know, what would you say that Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, the ISIS paper and her studies on with that, how does that correlate with what you presented? And then going back to W.E.B. Du Bois, we always talk about the talented 10th and what he's done. When people think of the positive things that he may have done, would you say, would you say that he may have done, and in all actuality, more studies to harm, right, persons of color, because but they haven't been published as much or repeated as much, right? Just with as far as segregation, right, and separating society, the Black community, right? So I would say he may be on the line of being an individual that caused more separation in our community than bringing it together.
It's a very fine line, but you're right. So first, thank you. I'm glad that you brought up Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. I sat at her feet for many years. My research comes directly on the heels of hers, because, you know, she always said, if you don't understand race and racism, white supremacy, then you don't understand how the rest of the world operates or works. For me, eugenics is that platform through which it actually works. So I always talk about eugenics as like a sprinkler system. It shoots high and it shoots low. So you'll have someone in West Virginia who's a poor white person who's been taught eugenics, but they've been taught eugenics in such a way where they still talk about skin currency. I may be poor, but at least I'm white, and I still have access to certain things based upon this currency of my skin. At the same time, it's shooting high, meaning it's in Ivy League institutions. It's in our Supreme Court laws. It's in our law enforcement. It's in our housing policy. It's in our education policy. So when you start to look at this pop culture, every avenue of American society, just as she's talking about race and racism, white supremacy, in every aspect, all of those areas that she defined, you'll find a eugenic trope in every last one of them. Okay. All right. And so again, if someone says, oh, that's racist, the first thing someone who's talking eugenics would say is, no, this is science. This is based upon genetically, or it's shown that Black people do X, Y, and Z. And so you start to have what they call race traits. All Black people do this. White people are more inclined to do this, 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 and this. With relation to, I'm sorry, your second question.
W.E.B. Du Bois, as far as separation.
This becomes a class issue.
Mm-hmm.
It really is about class at some point. It's about the intelligentsia, or, and excuse the term, but I like using it, the niggerati. So when we're talking the Harlem Renaissance, and you get these folks who literally say, I am a part of this, but I'm not necessarily of it. I'm slightly pulled away from this. Du Bois wrote a lot of his writings with relationship to eugenics. They talk about vigor, and you have to understand the language of eugenics. So when we talk about vigor, we're talking about a man's ability to reproduce. All right. So he's talking about vigor and Black people's vigor, but he's writing, and he's in France at this time. So the writings are there. It's just a matter of pulling them out and then pulling them back over here. The other thing is, again, the amazing thing about the internet and all this mass media now is that you have things like, again, that 1932 birth control review. It's the June 1932 edition. It would behoove anyone who's trying to study race and racism, and this idea that our leaders can go to the birth control review and sit down with Margaret Sanger and do an entire, they call it the Negro number. They did an entire edition of this magazine with Black scholars talking about how the worst of us are having too many babies. And they say things like human waste. These are Black people calling other Black people human waste. All right. And so you'll look a little bit further, and you may even see, I don't like bringing this up too much because I'm worried I'll get stoned, but at some point, Planned Parenthood actually gives an award to Dr. Martin Luther King. And in his speech, he couldn't make the event, but his wife delivered the speech for him. And that speech is readily available. Once again, just type in Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger Award, Martin Luther King, and you will see what he says about controlling the population of poor Black people in the South. So, again, we start to talk about class issues. All right. We start to talk about, if I say my mother was in Mississippi in 1966 and she was still picking cotton, which she was, and I was born in 1970, she was more inclined to listen to Fannie Lou Hamer than talking about getting thrown off of sharecropping farms for trying to vote than she was Dr. King, who was talking about riding on a bus that she wouldn't have had access to anyway.
Mhm.
You understand? So there are class issues in there that we never actually pull apart. It doesn't necessarily detract from the messages that these men or women had at that point, but it does let you know that sometimes the person who had their foot on your neck wasn't white. The person who left you out of the plan wasn't a white person. You know, these are upwardly mobile Black people who are saying, if you stop having babies and do X, Y, and Z, then you'll be a part of the American dream and you can stop having the issues that you're having. So we can't just, you know, rub over that and act like it hasn't happened.
Dr. Sherman, I have a question from a doctoral student, Stephen Thorne. He said, can you speak more, or a request, can you speak more about your presentation and how it relates to tracking of students, i.e. honors classes or, you know, advanced placement courses, gifted?
Well, this is the thing. I think it was always understood that there was a human touch to educating, and not everyone is meant to be an educator, all right? Part of the problem now is that we believe that students should be able to learn things rapidly, in a timely fashion. And if they're a little, I'm not even gonna say slower, but they don't grasp it at the same time that you believe everyone in the class should grasp it, you're considered a failure as the teacher. And so for that reason, instead of judging the teacher or saying we need to shift the teaching structure, you immediately say there's something wrong with the kids. You don't talk about the fact that there's 60 kids in a room and there's one teacher and every one of them is supposed to get this. You're not looking at that. So when you start to track students and you're talking about who has the capacity, when you start doing standardized tests and the kids are 9 years old, you've already made a determinant at that point that some of these kids just can't keep up. You don't factor in learning disabilities. You don't factor in the environment of the school. You don't factor in the environment of the home. You don't factor in things like kids are coming to school hungry. You don't factor in all of these other things that are necessary to say that this child has the capacity, but just isn't performing quite the way you would want at this particular time. And so that's one of the benefits, I think, years ago to having community schools, neighborhood schools where the teachers lived in the neighborhoods. And so they kind of had a better understanding. It was an extension of your household. Now these are strangers and it's about the bottom line. Can you do it? Can you get it done? And so when you start to track students, I always think that it's fallible. It's a falsehood. It doesn't work. All right. And that's why you have some of the best and brightest students who've been pushed into remedial courses or just dropped out. And at the same time, the ones who passed the test aren't necessarily functioning.
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Sherman. We are at time, so I'm going to close up. I have a whole list of thank yous, but I'll start with thank you, Dr. Sherman. Thank you, Dr. Leon, for bringing Dr. Sherman to our attention. This is phenomenal work. And it's, you know, we're going to talk more about this. We have a class that will start, just as a note, class will start at 7:45. I'm sorry, not 7:45, 6:45. We'll close up here and then we'll reconnect during our separate Zoom at 6:45. But Dr. Sherman, thank you so much. This was, you know, the challenge in your presentation is that it is so much and you have to make it as concise as possible, but this is a degree worth of information.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you concise so many points and helped us draw some of the, you know, connect some of the dots in such a short period of time. So thank you for that expertise, because that's a trained expertise. So thank you for your work and your expertise to do that. I can't thank you enough. I told you, and I'll tell everyone else, if I was rich and thank you, you'd have a pile of money and you're sitting in your office right there of thank yous worth of money, if you will. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I do have a list of thank yous to go with. Again, thank you, Dr. Leon, for returning, spending the time with us to return and introduce you. He's the one that encouraged me to ask you, and I really appreciate you taking this time and your expertise to do so. I'd like to thank everyone who participated, everyone who joined the Zoom and who asked questions and who sat back, took notes, and who's just ready to take this into the community. And I thank everyone who's on YouTube, who's doing the same thing. I want to thank Conference Services, Ms. Wedderburn. Without her, as I mentioned before we started, I'll say this again, before we started, we would be on a three-way call, trying to connect three-way calls, if not for Ms. Wedderburn. So thank you, Ms. Wedderburn, for being so supportive, being behind the scenes to making sure that this event was a successful event, both in the Zoom medium as well as the YouTube. She's navigating both at the same time, taking my questions. I have side questions, if you will, and she's right there lockstep. So with her assistant and her team. So thank you, Ms. Wedderburn and your team. This is our evening. We are already set for our third week, next week, where we talk about racism and prejudice. And our discussion today just feeds right in to that. So thank you. And by the way, you're welcome to come back and join in that discussion too, Dr. Sherman. We have Dr. Grace Carroll, who will be talking about the mundane extreme environmental stress of racism and prejudice. So this is where we are. We'll end tonight. I have comments asking, can we get your information? How can we purchase your book? So if you can send that information to me offline, I'll make sure that the world at Bowie gets that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. You've been great tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ms. Wedderburn, I think we're finished for this evening.